The first thing they did wasn't to ask how I was sleeping, or if the silence of these Blue Ridge Mountains felt too loud now. It was to throw away my husband's boots, Robert's old hiking boots, the ones he'd left by the back door, laces still tied, caked in the rich, red clay of the Appalachian trails he so loved. My son, Marcus, tossed them into a black trash bag with a dismissive flick of his wrist, just clearing the entryway. Mom, he said, as if Robert's memory was clutter. My daughter, Isabel, didn't even flinch. Just murmured something about streamlining the space. They did this before the scent of funeral lilies had fully faded from the hall. They were erasing him. And in doing so, they were trying to erase me, too. If they've ever acted like you weren't there until your absence echoed louder than presence, share your story. And if this feels like your table too, like and subscribe. My name is Clara, and in the 42 years I shared with my husband Robert in this house, nestled deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains, I thought I understood the language of silence. There was the comfortable silence of shared mornings on the porch, our hands wrapped around coffee mugs, watching the fog burn off the peaks as the world awakened in hues of soft gray and rose. There was the contented silence of evenings by the fire, the only sounds being the crackle of seasoned hickory logs and the whisper of turning pages from our respective armchairs. Robert used to say this house breathed with us, its old timbers sighing in a rhythm that matched our own. But the silence that had descended upon this house in the 8 days since we buried him was a different creature altogether. It was a hollow, ringing void, a predatory quiet that amplified every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the window panes. It was a constant, aching reminder of the low chuckle and steady footsteps that were no longer there to anchor the day. I was learning that grief was not a single event, but a vast, unfamiliar landscape you had to learn to navigate, full of treacherous flatlands of quiet and sudden, sharp canyons of memory. The first definitive act of desecration in this new landscape was not loud or violent. It was a quiet, deliberate gesture of erasure. While I stood by the kitchen window, staring blankly at the hummingbird feeder Robert had so meticulously maintained, I witnessed the symbolic beginning of their campaign. They chose to start with his boots, not just any pair, but the ones that felt like an extension of the man himself. In the hook, I mentioned their appearance, but the reality was so much deeper. I remembered the day he bought them, over 20 years ago, from an old shop in Asheville. He'd insisted on breaking them in properly, wearing them around the house for a week, his footsteps echoing with a new, determined rhythm. Those boots had carried him up and down these mountains through spring mud, summer dust, and autumn leaves. They had stood firm on rocky outcrops as he taught a young Marcus how to identify a hawk in flight, and had knelt in the soft earth as he showed a little Isabel the delicate petals of a lady slipper orchid. They were a map of his life etched in leather, and I had left them by the door as a small, foolish comfort, a tangible piece of him that hadn't been washed and packed away in a box labeled Memories. My son, Marcus, fresh off a plane from a glass and steel high-rise in Charlotte, performed the act. He did it with an air of detached efficiency, as if he were simply optimizing a workflow. He plucked them from the floor with 2 fingers, holding them away from his tailored trousers as if they were contaminated, and dropped them into a black trash bag he'd produced from under the sink. His other hand, I noted, was still holding his ever-present smartphone, its screen glowing with stock tickers or emails I couldn't see. Just clearing the entryway. Mom, he announced to the room, not even looking at me, his voice holding the same impersonal tone he used for his quarterly reports. He didn't see a lifetime of memories. He saw an obstruction. He didn't smell the faint, lingering scent of pine and damp earth. He saw dirt. My daughter, Isabel, driving down from her curated, minimalist life in Richmond, didn't even flinch. She simply nodded in approval. It opens up the space, makes for a better first impression, she murmured, her gaze already scanning the living room, her mind visibly rearranging the furniture we had lived with for decades, assessing it all for some unseen, future audience. They did this before the heavy, cloying scent of the funeral lilies had fully faded from the hall. They did it while my heart was still a raw, open wound, every memory a fresh wave of pain, in their minds. They were being practical, in my soul. They were performing an exorcism, methodically erasing the small, untidy, authentic pieces of their father's existence. And in doing so, they were trying to erase the life Robert and I had built, a life that was now, apparently, an inconvenience to their ambitions. Their phone calls throughout the preceding week had been the overture to this cold performance. It was a masterclass in veiled intentions. Not, "How are you holding up, Mom?" or "Is there anything you need from the city?" but a relentless, drumming cadence of questions disguised as forward-thinking concern. "We need to start thinking about unlocking the potential of the land," Marcus had said, his voice crackling over the line, the term unlocking sounding like something one does to a forgotten bank account. "It's a significant legacy asset, Clara, and market conditions are extremely favorable for this region." He had stopped calling me Mom in business-related contexts years ago. Isabel had been smoother, her words wrapped in the soft, aspirational language of wellness and opportunity. "Imagine freeing you from the burden of upkeep. Mom, this is a huge property. We could create something that truly honors Dad's love for nature, a sort of curated experience that allows others to appreciate the mountains the way he did." A curated experience. The phrase hung in the air, clinical and strange. Robert's love for nature was wild, spontaneous, and deeply personal. It was muddy boots and worn-out flannel, not a reservation-only spa treatment. They spoke of our home not as a sanctuary of memories, but as a portfolio to be liquidated, an asset to be leveraged. That afternoon, they called the meeting. The declaration was made over a lunch that no one touched, the cold cuts and artisanal bread sweating under the dining room lights. "We should all convene in the dining room at 4 o'clock, Marcus stated, not asked, to align on the path forward. The very phrase sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't the language of a grieving family seeking solace. It was the language of a corporate takeover, the mahogany dining table, a piece Robert's own father had made from a black walnut tree that once stood on this very property, had hosted countless Thanksgiving dinners, raucous birthday celebrations, and quiet, intimate family meals. It had borne witness to every stage of our lives. Now, as Marcus opened his sleek laptop and Isabel arranged glossy, heavy stock brochures in a neat stack, it felt like a boardroom. The warm, familiar space had been rendered sterile, transformed into a theater for their ambition. "So," Marcus began, clearing his throat and adopting a formal posture that was completely foreign to this room. "As you know, Isabel and I have been putting a lot of thought into how to best honor Dad's legacy while ensuring the family's long-term financial security." He clicked a button on his keyboard, and an image filled his laptop screen, a stylized logo of 3 mountain peaks, rendered in a cold blue and silver, with the words "The Appalachian Sky Retreat" in an elegant, soulless script beneath it. My breath caught in my throat. It was a brand. They had turned their father's name, our life, into a registered trademark. For the next 20 minutes, they walked me through their meticulously prepared vision. They weren't asking for my opinion, they were briefing me on a decision that had already been made. Marcus, in his element, spoke of zoning variances, investor circles, capital expenditure, and 5-year revenue projections. He showed me architectural renderings of minimalist, glass-walled cabins. He called them villas, that would replace the ancient stand of oak trees at the edge of the property, a place where Robert and I had watched generations of eagles fledge and soar. He pointed to a spot on a topographical map, right where Robert's beloved messy workshop stood, the workshop filled with the scent of sawdust and turpentine, its walls lined with his hand-drawn plans for birdhouses and bookshelves, and called it the future site of a holistic wellness center and yoga pavilion. The image on the screen showed smiling, slender people in white robes stretching towards the sun on a deck that overlooked the very cliffs Robert had considered sacred. Isabel chimed in, her voice a smooth, persuasive hum, a silken glove over the iron fist of their plan. She talked about the booming market for wellness tourism, about offering guests an authentic, transformative connection with nature, about farm-to-table dining experiences curated by a celebrity chef, and about guided meditation hikes. They spoke of the forest. Robert had so fiercely protected a forest, he knew tree by tree not as a living, breathing sanctuary, but as a feature, an amenity to be marketed alongside high thread count sheets and an infinity pool. The language was so polished, so confident, so utterly devoid of genuine emotion. It was almost hypnotic. They had reframed their breathtaking avarice as a forward-thinking favor to me, a way to release me from the burden of this old place, as if the life I had woven into the very fabric of this land for over 4 decades had been a mere chore. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, my teacup cold beside me. I summoned every ounce of my strength to keep my face a mask of quiet grief, an expression they conveniently mistook for passive acceptance. I didn't say a word. I let them talk. Let their vision of progress and profit and curated experiences fill the room, drowning out the silent, screaming echoes of my husband's laughter. When they had finally finished, the silence that fell was thick and heavy with their smug expectation. They looked at me, waiting for my blessing, for my relieved gratitude, for the applause at the end of their masterful presentation. After a moment that stretched for an eternity, Marcus slid a document across the polished surface of the table. It came to a stop just before my hands. It was a single, heavy sheet of paper, the kind lawyers use to signify importance. At the top, in stark, bold letters, it read, "Durable Power of Attorney and Asset Management Agreement." My eyes, blurry with unshed tears, scanned the dense paragraphs of legal text, but they all swam together until I saw the key phrases. Jumping out like predators from the page, majority control. 70% of all estate assets. Sole authority to develop, lease, or sell any and all real property. At the bottom was a neatly typed line with my full name, Clara Elizabeth Vance, and a stark, black dotted line waiting patiently for a signature. They wanted me to sign away my home, my life, the very soul of the land Robert had entrusted to me. They wanted me to sign it all away before his last will and testament was even read. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I did not give them the satisfaction of a reaction. The grief that had been a raging, chaotic storm inside me for days had suddenly receded, pulled back like a tsunami wave, leaving behind a profound and chilling calm. It was the terrible clarity that comes when you finally see something for exactly what it is, without the soft, forgiving filter of love or hope or shared history. This wasn't about my well-being, and it certainly wasn't about honoring their father. It was about leverage. It was a hostile takeover of a life. And they believed, with the supreme, unshakable confidence of the callously ambitious, that they held all of it. I slowly, deliberately, pushed my chair back from the table. The scrape of the wood against the floor was the only sound in the room. I rose to my feet, my movements measured. I didn't look at the document or at their expectant, faintly impatient faces. I simply turned, walked the few steps to the adjoining sunroom, and gently closed the old French doors behind me. The small brass handle cool against my palm. The click of the latch was quiet, but to me, it sounded as final as a gavel. I had left them alone in their makeshift boardroom. With their glossy brochures and their devastating contract, the battle had been declared, not with a shout, but with a signature line. And they had no idea that I had no intention of surrendering. They had no idea what a woman could build in the fortress of her silence. I stood in the sunroom for a long time, my hand resting on the cool glass of the French doors, my gaze unfocused on the familiar silhouette of the ancient oak tree in the yard. I was listening to the sounds from the dining room. There was a moment of stunned silence, followed by the rustle of papers and the low, indignant murmur of my children's voices. They were not concerned, they were irritated. My quiet refusal to engage, to play my assigned role as the grieving, compliant matriarch, had disrupted their schedule. I took a slow, deep breath, not for calm, but to draw in a different kind of strength, something colder and more solid than the grief that had hollowed me out for days. When I re-entered the room, their heads snapped up, their faces a mixture of impatience and condescension. Marcus had already loosened his tie, a general preparing for a minor skirmish. Isabel was tapping a perfectly manicured nail on the screen of her phone. It was then that I noticed my grandson, Daniel. He must have arrived while I was in the sunroom, let in by his uncle. At 16, he was a study in awkward contrasts, all the height of a man with none of the certainty. His lanky frame swimming in a fashionable hoodie. He sat in a chair away from the table, positioned as an observer, and he looked profoundly uncomfortable, his eyes darting from his uncle's tense face to his aunt's feigned composure, and finally, to me. His presence changed the very air in the room. This was no longer just about me and them. It was about the future, about the legacy that was meant to be passed down to his generation, in his confused, troubled eyes. I saw the true stakes of this battle. I let my gaze sweep over the table, deliberately ignoring the power of attorney document that lay between them like a declaration of war. My eyes landed on the worn leather portfolio I had brought down from Robert's study earlier that morning. I walked to the head of the table, my rightful place, and set the portfolio down with deliberate care. I untied the leather straps and drew out a sheaf of thick, cream-colored stationery, covered in my husband's familiar, slightly shaky handwriting, the last letter he ever wrote. "Your father," I said, my voice even and clear, addressing the room but looking at Daniel, left specific instructions. He wanted his own words read aloud, with no lawyers present, just family. I saw a flicker of annoyance cross Marcus's face. This was not on his agenda. "Mom, with all due respect," he began, his tone anything but respectful. "The official, notarized will is what matters legally. Miss Albright will handle that tomorrow. This is sentimental." "This," I replied, holding up the letter, the paper trembling almost imperceptibly with the weight of its purpose, "is his last will, and we will honor it." I did not raise my voice, but there was a finality in my tone that silenced him for a moment. I cleared my throat and began to read Robert's words. His voice, his love for this place, echoing in my own. "To my beloved family," I began. "If you are reading this, it means my time walking these hills with you has come to an end." Before I could finish the sentence, the first interruption came. It was Marcus. "Just a quick logistical point. Mom, when he says family, does that have any legal bearing on the distribution of non-trust assets, or is it purely a colloquial term?" It was the first chisel strike against the sanctity of the moment. I looked at him, my face impassive. "I am reading the letter as your father wrote it," I stated, and continued. I spoke of Robert's wish that the house, our home, would remain a place of sanctuary and peace for all of us. The second interruption was Isabel. "That term, sanctuary," she interjected, a small, thoughtful frown on her face. "From a branding perspective, that's very powerful. It aligns perfectly with the wellness ethos of the retreat concept. We should definitely incorporate that." I ignored her, my eyes fixed on the page. I read on, my voice tracing the lines about his hope that the forests would be preserved, that his children would teach their own children about the wildness he so cherished. On that point, Marcus cut in again, his third interruption. "The financials of preservation are tricky. The tax burden on undeveloped land of this acreage is significant. A partial, sustainable development would actually generate the revenue needed to preserve the rest. It's the fiscally responsible approach." He said it as if he were teaching a child basic economics. Daniel shifted in his chair, his sneakers squeaking softly against the hardwood floor. And so it went. I read and they dissected. Each sentence I uttered was not heard as a loving wish, but as a potential clause in a contract to be scrutinized, amended, or bypassed. They were not listening to their father's heart. They were scouting for loopholes in his legacy. When I read the part about his desire to leave a small fund for the local trail maintenance club, Marcus immediately asked about the tax implications of charitable donations versus establishing a family foundation, which offered, he noted, more control. That was the fourth interruption, when I spoke of his love for the workshop. Isabel mused aloud if the structure was zoned for commercial use, or if a variance would be required. The fifth, they questioned the dates. They challenged the phrasing. They debated the intent behind every sentence. I kept a silent count, a grim tally in the back of my mind. 7 interruptions, 10, 13 with each one. I felt a piece of my sentimental grief fall away, replaced by something harder, colder. I looked at my grandson. Daniel's face was a mask of confusion and dawning disappointment. He had come here to honor his grandfather, to hear his last words, and instead, he was witnessing a hostile corporate negotiation. He caught my eye once, a look of apology in his gaze, and I gave him the faintest, almost imperceptible nod, a silent message that said, "I see you, it's okay." The 21st and final interruption came when I was near the end of the letter. I was reading a passage where Robert implored his children to remember that the greatest inheritance was not in land or accounts, but in integrity and love. Isabel held up a hand, a gesture that was both polite and profoundly dismissive. "Clara," she said. The use of my first name a deliberate shift in power. "I think we all understand and appreciate the sentiment here. It's beautiful. but we are facing a complex financial reality. We have to view these wishes through a modern, practical lens. It's what Dad, as a pragmatic man, would ultimately want. That was it. The final desecration. To twist Robert's character, to remold his deep-seated principles into a justification for their own greed, was a betrayal deeper than any request for a signature on a legal form. I slowly, carefully, folded the letter along its original creases and placed it back in its leather sheath. I hadn't even finished the last paragraph. "We're done for today," I said, my voice quiet but absolute. The room fell silent. Marcus and Isabel exchanged a fleeting conspiratorial glance. They thought they had worn me down. They saw my surrender. Isabel even gave me a small, placating smile. "That's probably for the best, Mom," she said smoothly. "It's been an emotional day. We can circle back on the equity split tomorrow after we've all had some rest." They had no idea. They mistook my silence for weakness. In truth, it was my shield, my observation post, and in that moment, I knew, with absolute certainty, that it was about to become my sword. That night, the house was quiet again, but the silence had changed once more. It was no longer a void of grief, but a charged, electric stillness, the kind that precedes a storm. The anger had burned away, leaving only a cold, hard resolve that settled deep in my bones. I went into Robert's study, the room that was most like him, ordered, thoughtful, and filled with a quiet strength. I sat in his deep burgundy wingback chair, the leather worn into the perfect impression of his shoulders. My gaze drifted over his desk, his collection of fountain pens, the neat stack of birdwatching guides. And then I saw it, a small hardbound copy of Thoreau's Walden, its spine cracked from countless readings. It was the book he turned to when he needed to remember what was real, what was essential. On instinct, I picked it up. It felt heavier than it should. I fanned the pages, and near the middle, I saw that a section had been meticulously hollowed out. Nestled inside, fitting perfectly within the carved-out space, was a small dark gray rectangle of metal and plastic. It was his audio recorder. He was an avid birdwatcher, obsessed with capturing the specific, unique calls of the warblers and thrushes that populated our mountain. He had spent a small fortune on this device, a high-fidelity, professional-grade recorder capable of capturing the faintest whisper of a bird's song from 100 yards away. It was his secret weapon in his quest for the perfect recording. I lifted it from its hiding place. It was cool and solid in my palm. A plan, which had been a vague, formless wisp of an idea, began to crystallize into something sharp and clear. I thought of the 21 interruptions, the dismissive sighs, the cold, clinical language, the complete and utter contempt for their father's final wishes. I wished, with a sudden, fierce pang of regret, that I had been carrying this little device today. But the official proceedings, the meeting with the lawyer, was tomorrow. That would be the main event. That would be their final, polished performance, and I would be ready. With silent, deliberate movements, I pressed the small power button. A tiny red light, no bigger than a pinprick, blinked once and then held steady. The battery was still good. I swiped the screen, navigating the simple menu to the record function. I held it up and spoke a single word into the tiny, almost invisible microphone. "Robert," I whispered. I played it back. My voice was clear, crisp, and intimate, as if I were standing right next to myself. It would capture everything, every word, every sigh, every rustle of paper, every condescending chuckle. They thought tomorrow's meeting was a formality, a final legal hurdle to clear before they could begin bulldozing their father's memory. They believed they were in control, that their legal documents and financial projections were the only weapons that mattered in this fight. They had no idea that the most powerful evidence against them would be their own voices, their own words, captured and preserved by a grieving widow in a quiet room. I slipped the small, powerful device into the pocket of my cardigan, its slight weight a comforting promise. They were bringing lawyers and contracts. I was bringing the truth. The next morning, a fragile peace had settled over the house, the kind of tense, unnatural quiet that follows an argument left unresolved. My children moved through their rooms with a forced casualness, their conversation light and airy, touching on weather and stock markets, deliberately avoiding the raw, gaping wound they had opened the day before. They were acting as if their ambush had been a success, as if my silence was the white flag of surrender. I drank my coffee on the porch, watching the sun climb over the distant peaks, the slight weight of the recorder in my cardigan pocket, a secret anchor in the turbulent waters of their deception. It was a silent, secret witness, and today, it would have company. At precisely 10 o'clock, a modest dark blue sedan crunched up the gravel driveway. Miss Evelyn Albright emerged from the driver's side. She was a woman in her late 60s, her silver hair cut in a sharp, elegant bob, her posture radiating a calm, unshakable competence. She wore a simple but impeccably tailored gray suit, the embodiment of quiet authority, a stark contrast to the flashy, brand-conscious attire of my children. She was not here to impress. She was here to execute the law. I met her at the door, and her handshake was firm, her intelligent eyes meeting mine with a look of profound, unspoken solidarity. It was a look that said she had seen this play out 100 times before, in 100 different families. I led her into the dining room, which my children had once again arranged to resemble a boardroom. Marcus stood as she entered, extending a hand with the practiced charm of a CEO. "Miss Albright, Marcus Vance, a pleasure." Isabel offered a smooth, polished smile. "Thank you for coming." Miss Albright acknowledged them both with a polite but distant nod that offered no warmth, her focus entirely on the task at hand. "Clara," she said, turning to me, her voice softening just enough to be noticed. "Are you ready to proceed?" I simply nodded. Taking my seat at the head of the table, the recorder in my pocket was already on, its tiny microphone pointed towards the center of the table, ready to capture this second act. Miss Albright opened her handsome leather briefcase and removed a single, thick document bound in blue. "This," she began, her voice crisp and clear, filling the room with an immediate sense of finality, "is the last will and testament of Robert Samuel Vance, properly filed, witnessed, and legally ironclad. I will now read it in its entirety. Please hold all questions until the reading is complete." The last sentence was directed at Marcus and Isabel, a clear preemptive strike against the kind of chaos they had orchestrated the day before. She began to read. The language was dry, formal, full of the precise and unemotional terminology of the law. It was a world away from the heartfelt, poetic words of Robert's letter, yet it was an impenetrable fortress built to protect those very sentiments. Miss Albright's voice was a steady, unwavering drone as she detailed the disposition of various accounts and personal effects. I watched my children. They were not used to being silenced. The experience was visibly galling to them. Marcus's jaw was tight, his fingers drumming a silent, impatient rhythm on the table. Isabel's serene mask was firmly in place, but a small muscle twitched just below her eye. The first attempt to breach the wall came when Miss Albright reached the section regarding the house and the surrounding land. The property, known as 1450 Black Bear Ridge and its immediate 10 acres, shall remain in the sole possession of my wife, Clara Elizabeth Vance, for the duration of her natural life, to do with as she sees fit. Marcus cleared his throat. "Miss Albright, a point of clarification regarding the term immediate 10 acres. Miss Albright did not look up from the page. She simply held up a single slender finger, a gesture that instantly cut him off. "As I stated, Mr. Vance, all questions will be held until the reading is complete." The rebuke was quiet, utterly professional, and absolutely devastating. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his face flushing a dull red. He had been dismissed. She continued, her voice unwavering, until she reached the most critical section. "All remaining assets, including financial accounts and the remaining 190 acres of undeveloped land, are to be divided equally among his 3 children." She paused, letting the words land, and then she delivered the blow they never saw coming. "That includes the 1/3 share designated for his late daughter, Lillian Vance, which, per the terms of this irrevocable trust established on the date of her son's birth, is to be held for the benefit of his grandson, Daniel Robert Miller. The trust is to be managed by the appointed trustee, Mr. Alistair Finch of Finch and Associates, with Mr. Vance's sister, Catherine Miller, acting as Daniel's legal guardian and consultant on all decisions pertaining to the trust until he reaches the age of 25. The room was utterly silent. I watched the calculation and recalibration happen on my children's faces. An entire third of the assets, including the vast, valuable acreage that was the cornerstone of their Appalachian sky retreat, was not only not theirs, but was under the control of two people they could not manipulate: a scrupulous financial professional and their no-nonsense aunt. A woman who had never been impressed by their city-bred ambition. Isabel was the first to recover, her voice a silken, dangerous purr. And what is the flexibility on the terms of that trust? Miss Albright, for instance. If the family were to unanimously agree that leveraging the trust's assets for a family-run venture would yield a greater return. There is no flexibility, Mrs. Sterling, Miss, Albright stated simply, finally looking up and meeting Isabel's gaze with her own steady, unblinking eyes. That is the very nature of an irrevocable trust. The capital cannot be leveraged for such a venture without the unanimous consent of the trustee and the guardian, whose sole legal mandate is to protect the beneficiaries Daniel's best interests. The allocations cannot be modified. The polished smile finally vanished from my daughter's face. Marcus fell silent, his face a mask of cold, impotent fury. The foundation of their entire plan had just been blasted to pieces by the quiet, unassailable words of the law. They had come expecting to negotiate a corporate merger. They had just been handed an immutable decree. After the reading was concluded and the necessary papers signed, my signature firm and steady, theirs scribbled with barely concealed rage, I walked Miss Albright to her car. The tiny recorder in my pocket had captured every word, every frustrated sigh, every sharp intake of breath. As she paused with her hand on the car door, Miss Albright turned to me. I have handled hundreds of estates, Clara, she said softly, her professional reserve melting away for just a moment. What you are enduring takes a rare kind of strength. Robert was a wise man. He knew he needed to build a fortress for you. I met her gaze, feeling a surge of gratitude. He did, I whispered, and I'm not done defending it yet. I returned to the quiet house. My children were gone, having retreated to their respective rooms to lick their wounds and, no doubt, to plot their next move. I went directly to Robert's study, the command center for my quiet counteroffensive. I sat at his desk, connected the small recorder to his laptop, and watched as the audio file uploaded. It was a recording of a cold, legal proceeding, but to me, it was a symphony of their defeat. I saved the file, labeling it simply, official reading. Then I opened my email. I composed a new message, my fingers moving with a purpose I hadn't felt in years. The first recipient was Evelyn Albright. The second was Catherine Miller, Robert's sister, a no-nonsense rancher from the other side of the state. The subject line was just 2 words, for your records. The body of the email contained a simple sentence. Evelyn, Catherine, this is what happened the day before the lawyers arrived. Below the text, I attached the audio file from the first reading, the one from yesterday, the one with the 21 interruptions, the one where their contempt and greed were on full, naked display. I hovered my cursor over the send button. With each click of the keyboard, I felt as though I were setting a foundation stone for a fortress of my own, one built of truth and evidence. I was no longer just a grieving widow. I was an archivist of their betrayal. I took a deep breath and clicked the button. The email vanished into the ether. A digital arrow shot straight into the heart of their conspiracy. For the next few hours, I waited, I watered my plants, I made myself a cup of tea. I tried to read, but the words on the page wouldn't settle. Then, late in the afternoon, the phone rang, its shrill sound cutting through the heavy silence of the house. I looked at the caller ID. It was Catherine. I picked it up on the second ring. Clara. Her voice was tight, a low growl of controlled fury. I just listened to the whole thing. She was quiet for a moment, and I could hear her breathing, deep and ragged with anger. Those goddamn vultures, she snarled, the venom in her voice so potent it seemed to crackle over the line. To talk to you like that, to talk about their father, my brother, like he was some piece of real estate to be flipped. Don't you worry about a thing. You hear me? They won't get a single dime of Lily's money past me or that boy. I will fight them on any proposal that doesn't transparently, overwhelmingly, benefit Daniel. I promise you that. I closed my eyes, a wave of relief so powerful it almost brought me to my knees, washing over me. It was the first time since Robert's death that I hadn't felt completely, utterly alone in this fight. The first stone of my alliance had just been cemented in place. "Thank you, Catherine," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "That means more than you know." We spoke for a few more minutes, and then I hung up, my hand resting on the receiver. The war was far from over, but for the first time, I knew, with absolute certainty, that I was going to win. The day after my phone call with Catherine was one of quiet, strategic waiting. My children were subdued, moving around the house like chess players contemplating a losing board. Their initial shock had curdled into a sullen resentment. They spoke to me in clipped, overly polite tones, the civility more insulting than any outburst would have been. They were trapped here, bound by the social expectation of a grieving period, yet their minds were clearly elsewhere, buzzing with frustration and plotting their next move against the impenetrable fortress of Robert's will. I gave them a wide berth, retreating for long periods to the one room that felt like a true sanctuary, Robert's study. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I was simply seeking refuge, tidying the surfaces he'd worked on, running my fingers along the spines of his beloved books, trying to absorb some of the quiet integrity that saturated the very air of the room. It was during one of these quiet moments, while dusting a small side table, that my eyes fell upon it. Isabel, in a remarkable act of careless arrogance, had left her sleek, silver laptop open and awake. Perhaps she assumed I was too technologically illiterate to understand what I was seeing, or too lost in my grief to care. My intention was to simply close it, to respect a privacy she had not afforded her own father, but the screen glowed with a corporate blue presentation slide, and the heading, in a bold, sterile font, caught my eye: Legacy Management Strategy, the Appalachian Sky Retreat. Curiosity, cold and sharp, got the better of me. I leaned closer. It was their full pitch deck, the one they had presented to me, but this version seemed to be for their investors, full of more candid details. My eyes scanned the bullet points under a subheading titled Phase 1 Asset Consolidation. Then I saw it, the final bullet point on the slide. It consisted of just 3 words, but they landed with the force of a physical blow: maternal pacification strategy. I took a sharp, involuntary breath. The room seemed to tilt for a moment. It was not the greed that stole my breath, but the clinical, sociopathic precision of their contempt. Pacification, a term used for tranquilizing a wild animal, for quelling a riot, for neutralizing an enemy. It was not the language one used for a grieving mother. It was the language of a cold, calculated campaign. I saw myself through their eyes then, not as their mother, but as an obstacle to be managed, a variable to be controlled, a problem to be pacified until they could take full control. Without a second thought, my own phone was in my hand. The click of the camera shutter was almost silent. But in the quiet room, it sounded like a crack of thunder. I captured the image of the screen, another piece of irrefutable proof for the arsenal I was quietly building. I then closed the laptop lid with a soft final snap. My hands were trembling, not with fear, but with a quiet fury, cold and clean. That began to solidify in my veins. I needed to ground myself, to touch something real, something of Robert's that wasn't tainted by their scheming. My hand drifted to a lower shelf on his bookcase, to a row of identical, dark green, leather-bound volumes, his journals. He had kept one for every year of the last 2 decades, filling them with his thoughts, observations, and sketches. I had not had the heart to open them since his passing. The intimacy of his private thoughts felt too raw to face. But now, after seeing the cold strategy on that screen, I needed to connect with his truth. I needed to remember the man they were trying to erase. I pulled out the journal for the previous year and carried it to his desk. I sat in his chair, the scent of old paper and cedar enveloping me like a familiar embrace, and I opened to the first page. His handwriting, a strong, decisive script that had only begun to tremble in his final months, filled the page. I expected to read about the weather, about the birds he had seen, about the books he was reading, and those entries were there. But as I turned the pages, a different story began to emerge, a secret project, a final dream I never knew he had been cultivating with such care. It was not a plan for profit or a strategy for legacy management. It was a plan for service. His true will wasn't written on legal stationery, it was here, in these faded, ink-filled pages. He wrote about the young men and women he saw in town, veterans returning from deployments overseas, their eyes holding a quiet hollowness that he recognized. They have served the country, he wrote in one entry, and now the country seems to have no place for them. They need a purpose, not a handout. They need the quiet healing of these mountains, the same healing that has saved me 100 times over. He had sketched out a detailed plan for a small, volunteer-run program. He called it the Ridgeline Restoration Corps. The idea was simple, beautiful, and so quintessentially Robert to recruit local veterans and teach them the skills of trail maintenance, stonework, and conservation, to give them a new mission, protecting and preserving the Appalachian trails that had been his own sanctuary. He had listed the tools they would need, the sections of trail that were in most desperate need of repair, the local conservation groups he planned to partner with. He had even sketched a small expansion to his workshop where they could store tools and hold meetings. It was all there, a fully formed vision of a legacy not of wealth, but of healing and community. This was the sanctuary he had written about in his letter, the one Isabel had so casually co-opted for her branding ethos. A wave of love and sorrow so potent it made my chest ache washed over me. They had been planning a luxury retreat for the wealthy, while he had been planning a humble refuge for the wounded. In that moment, sitting alone in his study, I knew my path forward. I was no longer just the defender of his will. I would become the executor of his true, unspoken testament. That night, after a tense, mostly silent dinner, I found myself adrift in the quiet living room. The weight of the day, the sickening discovery on the laptop, the beautiful, heartbreaking revelation in the journals had left me emotionally exhausted. My mind was a battlefield of conflicting duties, the duty to my husband's memory versus the lingering, deeply ingrained maternal instinct to preserve my family. However broken it had become, seeking some comfort, some connection to a simpler time. I pulled a heavy velvet-covered photo album from the bottom shelf of the bookcase. Its pages were filled with the ghosts of a happier life. I sat on the sofa and opened it. There was Marcus, age 7, beaming with pride on his first two-wheeled bicycle, his small hands gripping the handlebars, with Robert's steadying hand resting on his shoulder. There was Isabel, a cherubic 4-year-old with a crown of dandelions in her hair, shrieking with laughter as Robert lifted her high into the air. Her small face level with the blooming dogwood trees. Page after page showed a life we had built together, family camping trips, Christmases by the fire, summer afternoons spent by the creek. They were a family I recognized, a family bound by love and laughter, not by asset valuations and legacy strategies. And as I looked at the smiling, innocent face of the little girl who had become the woman who wrote Maternal Pacification Strategy, a deep, treacherous wave of sorrow and doubt washed over me for a fleeting, agonizing moment. My resolve wavered. Was I doing the right thing, this war I was waging? This fortress I was building, was it worth the cost of completely severing these last frayed bonds? Was I destroying my family in the name of protecting a memory? The faces in these photographs were not monsters. They were my children. A mother's love is a stubborn, irrational thing. It searches for excuses. It grasps at the thinnest threads of hope. It wants to believe that the good, innocent child is still there, buried somewhere beneath the layers of adult ambition and disappointment. My finger traced the faded outline of Robert's smile in a photograph from our 25th anniversary. What would he want me to do? Would he want me to fight, even if it meant the final irreparable shattering of our family, or would he want me to find a compromise, to salvage some piece of the whole? The question hung in the silent room, heavy and unanswerable. I closed the album, the ghosts of the past too painful to bear. I looked up, out the large picture window that framed the night sky. The moon was high and bright, casting a silver glow on the dark, powerful silhouette of the Blue Ridge Mountains. They stood as they always had, immense, silent, and eternal. They were Robert's church, his sanctuary, his greatest teacher. And as I stared at their unwavering outline, the answer came to me, not in a voice but in a profound, quiet certainty. The family I was mourning in those photographs was already gone. It had not been destroyed by me this week, but had been slowly eroded over years, by choices my children had made, by values they had adopted that were the antithesis of everything Robert and I held dear. The innocent boy on the bicycle and the laughing girl with the dandelion crown were ghosts. The people who sat at my dining room table now, who saw a forest and saw only bored feet, who saw their grieving mother and saw only an obstacle, were strangers. My duty was not to the ghosts of the children they once were. My duty was to the man who had loved those mountains, the man who had taught those children to ride their bikes and laugh with abandon. My duty was to his true legacy, the one written in the pages of his journal. The doubt vanished, replaced by a resolve that was harder, sadder, but infinitely stronger than before. It was no longer a decision fueled by anger, but by a solemn, sacred sense of purpose. I would not be pacified. I would not compromise. I would honor my husband. The morning broke with a clarity that seemed to mirror the newfound purpose in my own heart. The oppressive humidity of the past few days had lifted, leaving the air crisp and the sky a high, brilliant blue. I found Daniel on the porch, sitting on the top step, listlessly scrolling through his phone. He looked up as I came out, a guarded, uncertain expression on his face. He was caught in the crossfire of a war he hadn't chosen, torn between the grandmother he loved and the slick, confident world of opportunity his uncle and aunt represented. They had likely spent the previous evening feeding him their own narrative, painting me as a sentimental old woman unable to see the brilliant future they were offering. I knew that arguing with their version of reality would be fruitless. The truth, like the mountains, did not need to be shouted, it simply needed to be seen. "There's a trail your grandfather used to call his thinking path," I said, my voice gentle. "The morning light through the hickories is especially beautiful this time of day. Would you care for a walk?" He hesitated for only a moment, then pocketed his phone and nodded. The silent rebellion of a teenager choosing a walk in the woods over a glowing screen was a small victory, but an important one. I grabbed a small canvas satchel from the hook by the door, into which I had already placed Robert's journal. And we set off, the quiet crunch of our footsteps on the gravel path the only sound between us. We walked in a comfortable silence for a while. I did not press him with questions or try to fill the space with talk. I let the forest speak for his grandfather. I pointed out the place where Robert had, with infinite patience, built a small stone retaining wall to stop a section of the path from eroding. I showed him the gnarled trunk of an old sourwood tree, its bark deeply grooved, and told him how Robert used to call it the old man of the mountain. We stopped to listen to the insistent, hammering rhythm of a pileated woodpecker, and I shared how Robert could distinguish its call from a dozen others. I was not lecturing him. I was giving him back small pieces of the man he had known, pieces that had nothing to do with assets or real estate. Finally, we reached a small, sun-dappled clearing with a simple wooden bench overlooking a deep ravine. It was a bench Robert had built himself from a fallen hemlock, positioned perfectly to catch the morning sun. We sat, and for a moment, we just watched the light filter through the canopy, dust motes dancing in the golden shafts. I saw the tension in Daniel's shoulders begin to ease. The forest had a way of stripping away the unnecessary, of calming the noise of the outside world. "Your uncle and aunt are very persuasive," I said softly, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. They see a future for this place, a very different kind of future. Daniel stared out at the ravine, his young face a mask of conflict. They said it would secure everything, for everyone, for me," he mumbled, the last part almost a question. "I know what they said," I replied. I reached into my satchel and pulled out the dark green leather-bound journal. I didn't open it. I simply held it out to him. "Yesterday, I found what your grandfather was dreaming about, his plans for the future. I thought you should see them for yourself." He took the journal from my hands, his fingers tracing the embossed year on the cover. He opened it hesitantly. I watched as he began to read. I saw his brow furrow in concentration, his eyes moving back and forth across the pages filled with his grandfather's strong, decisive script. I saw the moment his posture changed, leaning forward, becoming more absorbed. He was no longer just a boy caught between family members. He was a young man discovering a hidden testament. He read Robert's words about the returning veterans, about their quiet struggles, about the healing power of meaningful work. He saw the detailed sketches for the workshop expansion, the lists of tools, the hand-drawn maps of trails needing repair. He was silent for a long time after he finished reading the relevant entries. He slowly closed the journal and held it in his lap as if it were a sacred text. He didn't look at me, but back out at the vast expanse of green. "This," he said, his voice quiet with a newfound gravity. This is what he really wanted, all that stuff they were talking about. The spa, the villas, that wasn't for him at all, was it? "No, sweetheart," I said gently. "It wasn't. His legacy wasn't about building an empire, it was about healing a community." He finally turned to look at me, and the confusion in his eyes had been replaced by a clear, steady light of understanding. The war for his heart, I knew in that moment, was over, and I had won it not with arguments or accusations, but with the quiet, undeniable power of his grandfather's truth. That evening, I set the dining room table with the good china, the silverware that we only used for holidays, and the tall tapered candles Robert loved. I cooked his favorite meal, a simple roast chicken with rosemary and potatoes, the familiar, comforting aroma filling the house. When I had called Marcus and Isabel earlier to invite them to a final family dinner to discuss our path forward, they had readily agreed, their voices holding a note of triumphant relief. They had seen my placid demeanor throughout the day as a sign of capitulation. They believed their mother had finally come to her senses, that the emotional storm had passed and she was ready to be reasonable, to be pacified. They saw the carefully set table not as a stage, but as an olive branch. They arrived dressed for victory. Marcus wore a crisp shirt, his mood expansive, his earlier resentment replaced by a magnanimous, confident air. Isabel had on a soft cashmere sweater, her smile warm and her eyes bright. They believed they were here to accept my surrender. They brought a bottle of expensive wine, and Marcus opened it with a flourish, filling our glasses. "To family," he said, raising his glass, his eyes meeting mine over the rim. "And to new beginnings." "To new beginnings," Isabel echoed, her smile radiant. I raised my own glass, the candlelight flickering in the polished crystal. "To family," I said, "and to honoring legacies." They clinked their glasses against mine, completely oblivious to the double meaning, to the deep, cold irony of my toast. The meal began, and I let them lead. I played the part of the gracious host, a role I had perfected over 40 years of family gatherings. I asked about their jobs, their lives, listening quietly as they spoke. They mistook my serenity for surrender, my silence for agreement. They didn't notice the new steely calm in my eyes or the complete absence of grief in my voice. As expected, it was Marcus who couldn't help but turn the conversation back to business. "So, Mom," he began, leaning forward conspiratorially, "I had a very promising preliminary chat with an investor group from Atlanta today. They're extremely interested in the Appalachian sky concept. Extremely." He was practically vibrating with excitement. They understand that the trust for Daniel complicates the land asset, but they see ways to structure the deal around it. We could potentially buy out the trust's land share over time, or offer a minority stake in the operating company. There are options. "The branding is key," Isabel chimed in, her voice animated. "They loved the focus on exclusive, high-end wellness. We're not just selling rooms, we're selling a transformative experience. We could even name one of the signature hiking trails after Dad, the Robert Vance Memorial Trail. It would be a beautiful tribute." I listened, my expression serene, my hands resting in my lap. I watched them build their beautiful, elaborate sandcastle, describing its towers and moats in exquisite detail, entirely unaware that the tide was already coming in. It was like watching actors in a play, earnestly rehearsing their lines for a show that had already been canceled. There was a part of me that felt a deep, profound pity for them in that moment. They were so blinded by their ambition, so hollowed out by their pursuit of more, that they were completely incapable of seeing the truth, even when it was sitting right across the table from them. They were celebrating a victory that was not only unearned, but that had already been rendered impossible. The final act of their self-deception was playing out over their father's favorite meal, on the fine china he had inherited from his own mother, and I, their pacified mother, simply watched, my heart calm and steady, waiting for the perfect moment to let the curtain fall. I let the silence hang in the air after Isabel's enthusiastic pronouncement, letting her words about a beautiful tribute echo in the space between us. I watched as Marcus topped off his wineglass, a self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips. They were so close to the finish line, so certain of their victory. They were waiting for me to concede, to offer my formal, if reluctant, blessing. I took a slow sip of water, placed my linen napkin carefully on the table beside my plate, and then I stood up. My movement was slow, deliberate, and it immediately commanded their attention. The buoyant, celebratory mood in the room instantly vanished, replaced by a tense, expectant silence. They still thought this was the moment of my capitulation. "Your plans are very ambitious," I began, my voice calm and even, carrying easily through the quiet room. "The presentation was very polished, but they are, I'm afraid, completely irrelevant." Isabel's smile froze on her face. Marcus's wineglass stopped halfway to his lips. "What do you mean, Mom?" he asked, a note of sharp impatience cutting through his voice. "We're talking about a multi-million-dollar venture here. It's hardly irrelevant." "It is irrelevant," I repeated, my gaze moving from his face to my daughter's. "Because this land, the soul of this place, is not for sale. It will never be for sale." I paused, letting the finality of that statement sink in before delivering the coup de grace. "As of this morning, I met with Miss Albright and signed an irrevocable directive. The 190 acres of forest, as well as Robert's workshop, have been placed into a newly established charitable foundation. It is called the Roberts Ridge Foundation." The color drained from Marcus's face, leaving it a pasty, sickly white. Isabel's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. They stared at me, their eyes wide with a disbelief so profound it was almost comical. It was the look of people who had been so certain of the rules of the game, only to find out the entire board had been removed from the table. "You can't do that," Marcus finally stammered, his voice a hoarse whisper. That's our inheritance. Your monetary inheritance, as outlined in your father's legal will, remains completely untouched," I clarified, my voice still level, still calm. "You will each receive your designated share of the financial assets. I have not touched your money. But the land, the part of your father you sought to desecrate, the living, breathing heart of his life that you tried to leverage and liquidate, is now beyond your reach. It is protected. It is permanent." I picked up the worn journal from the sideboard where I had left it and placed it on the center of the table. "The Foundation's sole purpose will be to fund the Ridgeline Restoration Corps, a program your father designed to help local veterans find purpose by healing the very trails he loved. His legacy will be one of service, not sales. That was his true will." The room was utterly, profoundly silent. The only sound was the soft flicker of the candle flames, casting long, dancing shadows on their stricken faces. The grand vision of the Appalachian Sky Retreat, with its villas and its spas and its investor interest, had evaporated into thin air. Their entire enterprise, built on a foundation of arrogance and greed, had been dismantled by a quiet act of love and a few strokes of a pen. They left without another word. There were no angry shouts, no final pleas. They were too stunned for that. They simply stood, gathered their things like automatons, and walked out of the house, leaving their half-eaten gourmet meal to grow cold on the table. I sat alone in the quiet dining room for a long time, the scent of rosemary and ambition hanging in the air. I didn't feel victorious or triumphant. I didn't feel a surge of vengeful satisfaction. I felt a profound, deep, and quiet sense of peace. I had kept my word. I had honored my love. The next morning, I awoke to a different kind of silence. The oppressive, resentful quiet of the last few days was gone, lifted like a heavy fog. The house felt lighter, as if it could finally breathe again. I took my coffee out to the front porch and sat in the old rocking chair, watching the sun crest the ridge, painting the sky in soft hues of lavender and gold. The air was cool and clean, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. I felt Robert's presence beside me, not as a painful absence, but as a warm, comforting stillness, a quiet approval that settled over me like a blanket. The war was over. Around 9 o'clock, a dusty, slightly battered pickup truck rumbled up the drive and parked near the workshop. A young woman, likely in her early 30s, hopped out. Her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her face, though etched with a weariness around the eyes that spoke of things I could only imagine, held a clear, determined light. She was the first volunteer for the Restoration Corps, a veteran Catherine had helped me contact. She walked over to me, a little shy, and extended a hand. Mrs. Vance, I'm Sarah. I wanted to say thank you for this opportunity. It is I who should be thanking you, Sarah, I said, taking her hand. Robert would have been so honored. She gave me a small, grateful smile and then headed towards the workshop, her steps full of a purpose that had been missing for too long. Just then, the front door opened and Daniel emerged, blinking in the bright morning sun. He was no longer wearing the sullen, guarded expression of the past week. In his hands, he held a pair of thick leather work gloves. He walked over to my chair and looked out at the truck, then back at me. "Grandma," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "I was wondering, if it's okay, could I stay for the summer to help out?" I looked at my grandson, at this young man standing on the cusp of his own life, choosing a summer of hard work and service over the empty promises of his uncle and aunt. I saw his grandfather's integrity reflected in his clear eyes. And I knew, in that moment, that the true inheritance had been passed on. It wasn't in a bank account or on a deed. It was in the quiet strength I saw in him, in the unspoken promise to tend to what is good and true. I would love that more than words can say. "Daniel," I replied, my voice thick with an emotion that was no longer grief, but a deep and abiding joy. As he walked towards the workshop to join Sarah, I leaned my head back against the rocking chair and closed my eyes, the warm sun on my face. I hadn't gotten revenge. I had received something far better. I had received a future for my husband's spirit, not as a brand name on a luxury retreat, but in the quiet dignity of a veteran finding purpose, in the protected hush of a forest that would now stand for generations, and in the hopeful, determined heart of my grandson. In the end, I didn't just protect Robert's legacy, I became its guardian, and in that sacred duty, I had finally truly found my peace.